And for more on the protests, we're joined now by Captain Delrish Moss. He's now with the Florida International University Police Force. He also served as a police chief in Ferguson, Missouri. That city, of course, a boiling point in 2014 following the controversial shooting death of a black teen by a white officer. Captain Moss served as police chief, we should note, after that 2014 incident. Captain Moss, thanks so much for joining us. I wanted first your thoughts about these protests, how quickly they've spread, and where are things really out of control based on what you can see, if at all?
Well, it's difficult for me here in South Florida to say where things are out of control, but one of the things that's happened is what's unusual about this is the fact that it sparked protest or sister protest all across the nation. I know Minneapolis is the epicenter of where all this is happening, but across the nation you're starting to see people voice their anger. And I think that's one of the challenges for police chiefs. You know, we can make relationships with our particular communities, but when you have outside forces come in, you haven't had time to build relationships with them.
Beyond the magnitude of having this spread to so many cities and so quickly, how is this different than Ferguson 6 years ago? And as I mentioned, you were not the police chief at Ferguson in 2014. You came after. But how is what we're seeing now different than what it was 6 years ago?
You know, I don't think it's vastly different than what we were seeing in Ferguson, other than the fact that it spread to other communities. I think what happened in Ferguson is very similar to what's happening in Minneapolis right now. You know, but obviously when you're in the middle of something, it seems like it's worse than the last thing. This is very reminiscent not only of Ferguson, but of Miami in the 1980s.
Have police tactics, have their strategies at all changed? Have they improved? And also, is social media changing the game? I mean, I see everybody out there with a phone, pictures get live streamed instantaneously. We're watching some of these very, very strong pictures at the moment. How are things changing in terms of the police response, but also the actions of the protesters?
Well, with regard to the police response, in the United States you have 18,000 police departments, and all of them train differently and have a different approach to things. There are some things that are uniform. There are some things that we look at in terms of best practices, but I think every city is caught off guard when this happens because this is just not the norm. So it's really difficult to say how tactics have changed. In police departments where they've had experiences like this, they've been able to make changes and adjustments so that they can deal with the next situation. But a lot of areas are caught totally off guard by this. I don't know the history in Minneapolis. I don't know if they've had to deal with things like field force training and all those things in the past. But I can tell you from this point forward, they will start to incorporate those things. The second part of your question was, I forgot.
About the protesters, social media, the approaches by the protesters, has that changed?
So social media has been a huge change. In fact, in Ferguson, social media was one of the things that caught that police department off guard because they had never actually had to deal with that spread and people coming in large droves to Ferguson from all across the nation. One of the things that social media has made is the world a whole lot smaller. And so when something happens in Miami or something happens in Seattle, there are people who actually travel and want to be a part. And you talk about groups like Black Bloc, who are professional protesters, really, who do nothing but go from place to place, actually infiltrating other protests, making their voices heard as well. And you know, often that's in conflict with the general message, but certainly a valid message nonetheless.
Are you confident that curfews, as some cities have suggested, will help weed out who's come from other places and will help really separate the legitimate protesters from really what seems to be agitators?
I think curfews are probably the best way to go in that regard, because what happens is the people who are actually planning to peacefully protest, they go home. And that allows the people that puts people who have come in from out of town to agitate and to infiltrate the peaceful protest an opportunity to be standing out on an island by themselves as everyone else has gone home. So it's a time-tested technique that really works.
President Trump has threatened on Twitter to unleash, quote, the unlimited power of the military. For us here in the U.S. and indeed for people abroad, what does that mean?
That's a question you're going to have to ask President Trump. I know that one of the things that happens in cities, we have a federal government, but we have lots of local governments here. and every city responds differently and certainly independently of the federal government. What he means, only he knows.
All right, Captain Delrish Moss, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts.